TRE, Talk Radio Europe.
Joining us on the line now is Ian Pearson to talk about his experiences walking the Camino. His book is called My Poor Plates of Meat, Eating and Drinking My Way Along the Camino de Santiago. Welcome to the show, Ian.
Hello, Hannah.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us. So when did you do this walk?
We did it in 2018 in the months of April and May.
Okay. And what inspired you to do it? Had you done anything like this before?
We've done some long distance paths before in the UK. So we walked across the Yorkshire Dales and the Cotswold Way. But we stumbled across the Camino de Santiago in about 2010. We were supposed to be walking sections of the Great Wall in China. And that was the same time that the Icelandic volcano erupted.
Yeah,
which I can never pronounce. It's something like Eyjafjallajökull.
Well done.
So our plane was grounded. So we decided that we had 3 weeks holiday booked, and we would go on a boat to Santander and spend some time in Rioja. And it was at that time that we kept seeing these people with backpacks on, walking along the N120, and we couldn't work out what they were doing. Were they sort of Spanish equivalent of the Duke of Edinburgh's or army manoeuvres or a sponsored walk? And we happened to meet a group of them in the pub, in a bar, and they said they were pilgrims. And we said, well, where have you walked from? And they said, well, we walked 200 kilometres from the east in France, and we're walking another 600 kilometres to the west to Santiago de Compostela. So that sowed the seeds, and then in 2018, the opportunity arose to have 2.5 months off to actually walk the route.
Wow, amazing. So how far did you walk? How much were you walking each day?
The route we undertook was 800 kilometres. In fact, at the end, we got a bit restless and added on another 100 kilometres. So we were walking about between 15 and 22 kilometres a day, which doesn't sound a huge number. They may do to lots of people, but to the seasoned walkers, it's not a huge amount, 50 miles a day. But if you're doing it day after day after day, and you have to walk over mountains as well on occasion, it can become quite grueling.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the thing. If you're doing any hills, things like that. Are there many hills on the Camino?
On day one, there's the Pyrenees.
Yeah, that's quite a hill.
When we started at the beginning of April, the weather was atrocious. We were the first weekend of the walking season. And there are 2 routes over the top. One's called the Napoleon route, which is quite rugged and open. And the other, the Charlemagne route, which actually follows the main road, a path along the main road. And we were advised by the Pilgrim Office to go along the Charlemagne route, which was good, really, because when we actually got to Roncesvalles in Spain, we found quite a few people having been airlifted off the top of the Pyrenees because the weather was so atrocious.
Gosh, that's crazy. So, I mean, were there some hair-raising moments then? Were you kind of...
The first few days are the hardest because there are lots of routes. When we say Camino de Santiago, actually what we're talking about is Caminos de Santiago, because there are lots of routes. So Camino means way, as in byway or highway or motorway. It's a route. And of course, Santiago is St. James. So it's the route of St. James. And they all end up at Santiago de Compostela. Compostela means campo. My Spanish is atrocious, I believe, is field. And Stella, of course, is star. So it's St. James under the field of stars. So there's lots of different routes. There's the route that we took, which is the French route, which goes from Saint-Pied-de-Port in France over the Pyrenees. But there are lots of other ones. There's the Portuguese Camino, there's the Andalusian Camino, and the Camino Inglés, the English Camino, which goes from the north of Spain. So I digressed and forgot what your question was. Sorry, Anna.
Well, if you'd ever come across any kind of hair-raising moments.
Oh yes, sorry, yes. I think it's just that the Pyrenees are the most difficult climb of the whole route, and they are very difficult. You've got 10 hours of climbing up over the Pyrenees up to Roncesvalles, up to the monastery at the top. And it was particularly snowy and cold and windy at the top. Other than that, most of the route is quite flat. You're walking along northern Spain, you sort of touch on the Picos de Europa in the middle. But other than that, apart from things going wrong and breaking things and rucksacks breaking and injuries, we were quite lucky that nothing particularly went wrong. But there a lot of people suffered injuries, and a lot of those, or some of those, dropped out.
Yeah. So what injuries did you have? Blisters, I guess.
Well, I was very lucky. I didn't. I did a lot of training before we went, because we in England we live in Somerset in a range of hills called the Quantock Hills. So it was quite easy to go out twice a week and practice walking. My partner Lynn suffered from a nasty groin strain on day one.
Oh no!
Which plagued her the rest of the journey.
Gosh, how awful to get an injury on day one and then have to climb the Pyrenees.
Yeah, it's not unusual, purely because on the Camino Frances you have to go to the Pyrenees, and they are a large range of mountains, and you just forget how big they are, and how much of a challenge it is. Other than that, it's just grueling. Just getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning every morning, putting your rucksack on, and then getting out and then walking for 7-8 hours.
Yeah. And was it a nice thing to do together, to share with your partner? Because a lot of people do it as a real kind of spiritual journey and to kind of connect with nature or connect with themselves. How was it doing it with someone else?
Oh, we'd run out of conversation by day 2 and had nothing to say to each other. Actually, what you find on the walk, and it's quite interesting, is that people walk at their own pace, even though people walk together. And we made lots of friends on the Camino and walked with them. But what you found is that often someone was 10 paces ahead or a little bit ahead. So you tended to walk as a group, but on your own quite a bit, if you see what I mean. And you do run out of conversation quite quickly. But you meet so many people with so many different stories about why they're walking the Camino. You get into conversation every hour or so with someone.
Can you think of a highlight, a really interesting person who you met?
Probably the most interesting person we met was a German couple, Wolfgang and Elke. And we happened to meet them in a restaurant halfway along the walk. And we said, your English is very good. And he said, oh, my father was in England during the Second World War as a prisoner of war. And we said, whereabouts was that? And he said, Somerset. And we said, well, whereabouts in Somerset? And he said, Taunton. And of course, we live just a few miles from Taunton. So after we walked the Camino, later on in 2018, he came over to see where his father had been interned during the Second World War. And the Nissen hut, or the Nissen huts, in which was the prisoner of war camp, are still there. So he could actually see where his father stayed in the mid-40s, or 1944 and 45, all those years ago.
Wow, how amazing. So have you met up with them since?
Yes, we went. They live near the Black Forest, and we went over this year and stayed with them for a week in Germany. So that was lovely.
Oh, fabulous. And tell me about the significance of food and drink during the Camino. It seems to be...
We're foodies and love Spain in general and northern Spain and the way the Spanish eat. And I just love that sort of tapas culture and eating late at night. The Camino was quite an interesting experience because people get up very, very early in the morning. They don't eat like the Spanish on the Camino. They tend to eat about 6 o'clock in the evening, which is an anathema to the Spanish. There's a lot of communal eating and a lot of pasta and red sauce. Each of the restaurants along the Camino does a pilgrim menu, which are all priced between about 8 and 12 euros, or were in 2018. And they consisted of a bread, starter, main course, dessert, and a glass of wine. Because we were going through Rioja, we wanted to taste some of those lovely reds that you get over there. In that sort of area, there were a lot of sort of hearty stews. And as we moved along westward, of course, we went into Galicia with its sort of octopus country, and then we end up at Finisterre at the end, which of course was a lot of seafood. So we do like our food, and we ate very well along the route.
So did you manage to find nicer places, shall we say, along the route? You weren't always in places sharing with other people?
Yes, we had a whole range of accommodation. So sometimes we stayed in large dormitories, in monasteries, and that was interesting. Often you were quite tired at night, so you just went to sleep. Didn't matter where you were, really. We stayed in lots of casa rurales, those sort of little bed and breakfasts, which were lovely because we were looked after by the natives who fed us the sort of local cuisine. We stopped at some very, very nice restaurants and accommodation. So we had a whole mixture. We sort of spread our fevers a lot. So we stayed from anything from monastery dormitories to 5-star hotels.
Yeah. And what was your favourite? Did you prefer the 5-star hotels or not necessarily?
I prefer those little Spanish B&Bs run by local people where you could actually sit with the locals as such, and local food and local wine. That's what I really enjoyed. We had a few months of Spanish lessons, completely forgotten now, before we went. So we would sit down, and after a few glasses of wine, we could sort of half converse.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I think it would be easy for people to assume that staying 5-star is always, the best way to go. But as you say, you can get a much more authentic experience of the country, the food, the people by staying in a cheaper place, in a dormitory or something like that.
Some of the dormitories were just full of pilgrims, and so you perhaps didn't get to meet the locals. But we went out of our way to go to local restaurants, and then after dinner we usually ended up in some locals bar drinking Vetinaro and then staggering home.
And when and why did you decide to write a book about it all?
I'd written a book a few years earlier because, as I said, we live in Somerset, and there's a mid-distance path called the Coleridge Way, which runs from the village in which we live, 51 miles to Lynmouth in Devon. And so I wrote that. So I was sort of quite used to writing, and I liked writing. And we kept a diary as we walked, and it was just natural for me to write it up. And so I wrote it up, and 165 pages later, we've got a whole book on our experiences.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, if people want to read it, it's called My Poor Plates of Meat, Eating and Drinking My Way Along the Camino de Santiago. It's available to buy on our website, tre.radio, and it's by Ian Pearson, who we've been chatting with today. Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Hannah.
TRE, your voice in Spain.